Hi everyone. Today's episode I'm going to start fabricating a jig for a custom independent rear suspension, or IRS, for the electric Trans Am project. Since I'm putting a Tesla drive unit in the Trans Am, there is no suspension I can go out and buy to house the Tesla motor that will fit under the rear of the 78 Trans Am. A lot of people end up taking the whole rear suspension subframe and motor assembly out of Teslas and then find clever ways to fit the subframes under their EV conversions. But that's not going to work for me. The Tesla IRS is 6 inches wider than the Trans Am's original suspension and body. I could have flared out the quarter panels to make the Tesla suspension fit, but I didn't want to change the look of the car in that way. So I decided to make the rear suspension myself. So we're going to start by building a jig for a custom rear suspension design. I did some research to find other companies that were designing IRS systems for second generation F-bodies and looked at how they were designing their independent rear suspensions around the factory frame rails of the car. And then I came up with my own idea of what I could do under my car. Now, my idea isn't a one-off of suspension geometry. I'm not smart enough to do that kind of math and problem solving. Instead, I'm sticking with newer GM suspension to go under the Trans Am. What I'm going to use is 5th generation Camaro suspension geometry. If GM would have kept the Pontiac brand going, I'm sure the new Trans Ams today would have been using this suspension. So I'd like to think that this is still Trans Am suspension that I'm installing. Now, the 5th generation Camaro's IRS system has a track width that is 4 inches wider than the 2nd generation F bodies. So I'll need to narrow the new suspension to fit under my Trans Am, so I won't have to do any body modifications to make the tires fit in the rear. So I'm going to start by making a sliding plate. I used 2-inch square tubing and 1.5-inch square tubing to make a frame, and then I used the 1.5-inch square tubing to allow the frame to slide in and out, and then I added a tape measure to those tubes. I put some bolts on the bottom of it, vertical and horizontal bolts, so I could tighten down the frame once I got it into the position I wanted. I also put a grid pattern on the sliding plates, so that way when I mounted the Camaro subframe to the top of the plates, I could set the subframe in a position where I knew everything was centered. I also made sure to know what my datum heights would be as well from the original Camaro frame specs. I wanted to make sure my front mount points would be level with my rear mount points. This way I knew that I would have level control points when I started mounting the lower control arm jig points. I then installed all the original suspension into the subframe. I raised the hub assembly to the very most outer point it would be, which is pretty much level, so that I would have the widest track width the suspension would be. This position also is the closest to what the loaded suspension would look like. Here I welded my first control points to the jig plate, which is a crucial point because this will set level and center in the wheel openings of the car. I can now mount the upper control arm mounting points to the subframe using spacing tubes and bolts for the rear control arm mount point. And I made a U-shaped bracket that I could remove with nuts and bolts in order for me to take the upper control arm jig points out later so that I can remove the cross member from the mounting plate. If I did not do this and weld the upper control arm mounting points in place, it would make the subframe solid to the jig, and I wouldn't be able to remove the subframe later when I was done with it. Moving to the lower control points, I took a bolt that fit into the lower control arm mount point. I then found a metal tube to fit snugly around the bolts, and then I cut the metal tube to fit between the lower control arm mounting points. I think it's important here to mention that I wanted everything to fit as snug as possible so that I had a true center reference point for when I build my own control arms. Once I installed those, I welded a tube onto the mounting point, and then I was able to slide another tube around the outside of that one and weld the two of them together and then weld that to the jigging plate. Now that I'm done welding all the control points onto the jig plate, I can remove the subframe from the jig plate and remove the mounts that suspended the subframe in the air. I cleaned up the jig plate and gave it a paint job to help it from rusting, and now I need to go ahead and remove the rear end from the Trans Am and then go ahead and get the jig plate mounted underneath the car. The first thing I'm going to do when positioning the jig underneath the car is I'm going to establish my height first. And after I establish my height, I can then focus on centering the jig plate left and right underneath the car. Now this sometimes has to go hand in hand, because once you move something one way, it'll throw off your dimensions the other way. So it's a process you have to go through, going back and forth to get exactly what you want. To get the right height for the jig, I had to cut out the trunk floor of the car. I had anticipated this when I had thought up to use a Tesla motor. I knew it would be way too tall to fit underneath the rear of the car. At this point, I'm sure you've noticed that I have slid the plate closed to allow me to narrow the rear end 4 inches. But with establishing the jig points, I'm able to keep all the same geometry as the 5th generation Camaro suspension had. So now let's look at how I centered the suspension jig to the vehicle. So basically, I took a laser level and shot the laser down the center of the jig, and then made sure the laser line centered up with the underside of the car. I used multiple points on the car to make sure that I was getting a true center line down the center of the vehicle. Now you're probably wondering why you don't see a floor between the rear end of the car and the front of the car. Well, that's a story for another episode. We'll see you next time on that. If you look under the jig plate, you'll notice that the laser line comes through the crack of the jigging plate, and it hits the center of my tape measure there. So I'm establishing center line on all points. Here you can see, going down the transmission tunnel, that I have marked out where the center of the transmission tunnel is, and then we can look at the line on the transmission tunnel and see that it is centered to that point as well. I guess I should note here that before I did any work to this car, before I replaced the quarter panel, before I tubbed the rear end, before I did any work to this car, I hung centerline gauges on the frame rails of this car, front to rear, and I made sure that this car was completely square. The height of the car was good, the center line of the car was good, and at that point I was able to mark center lines along the vehicle, knowing that everything was symmetrical on this car. Here you can see the center line shot all the way from the back of the jigging plate to the very front of the bumper cover, and the center line of the laser is almost center with my front bumper cover mount points. I would say that this car is pretty close to centered, and we should only have like maybe 1 millimeter of sway from the back of the car to the front of the car, which in my opinion is really good. So now that I know that this jig is centered to the vehicle, I can go ahead and make this jig more permanent to the rear frame rails of the car. The factory puts control points in their frame rails that are symmetrical from left to right. So what I've done is used pins in these control points, welded to tubes, welded to the jig plate so that this jig plate cannot be put in any place but one. I also used a threaded hole the factory used for the original suspension and bolted a tube there, then welded the tube to the plate. So now that that's all done, I can go ahead and build my own subframe to house the Tesla motor while using 5th generation Camaro suspension points, or as I would like to look at it, 5th generation Trans Am suspension control points. Well, that's it for now. On the next episodes, I'll show you the problems I ran into trying to build a subframe for this project. Thanks for watching, and hit that like and subscribe button to see the joys and pitfalls I experienced through this build. Don't forget to share this with a friend so you can all share in my misery and learn from my mistakes. Till next time, y'all stay safe out there, and we'll see you soon.